Welcome to Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, where we talk about gospel insights through great stories and help you find entertainment that is both true and beautiful. I'm your host, Carl Cranny. I have a PhD in religion, and I like to write on the intersection of religious themes in pop culture. And we have a wonderful panel today with 5 of us, so it's going to be very busy, but very good. And with us today is my co-host, Liz. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Liz.
Hi, I'm Liz Busby. I am a writer of science fiction and fantasy and a reviewer of books and a Latter-day Saint.
Excellent. And with us today, we have 3 newcomers. We'll start with Stephen. If you could introduce yourself, please.
I'm Stephen Cranny. I'm actually Carl's little brother. I have a PhD in sociology and demography from the University of Pennsylvania with an emphasis in kind of the sociology of religion. However, currently I'm a data scientist in the DC area, occasionally teaching a class here and there at, Catholic U, although I am a Latter-day Saint as well.
And Jennifer, could we get you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Jennifer Roach. I work as a mental health therapist, adjunct classes at BYU, Idaho, in the Family Studies Department. My degrees are in therapy and divinity. So I love the intersection of theology and how people work that out. Latter-day Saint.
Excellent. And Sergio, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Sergio. I'm a high school English teacher. Occasionally I write. I'm a frequent user of Twitter. I think I'm the token Catholic for this group right now. So, yeah.
Well, we are excited to have you on. There are a lot of Catholic themes in the show, and that's why we searched far and wide to find a nerdy Catholic who would be willing to join us, so thank you for coming on. Today we'll be discussing Midnight Mass, a Netflix miniseries from horror director Mike Flanagan. When a young Catholic priest arrives at the small fishing community of Crockett Island, literal miracles begin to occur, but at what cost? But before we get into that segment, we're going to do our best books portion, where we each recommend something we are watching, reading, or listening to, or in my case, something that I have listened to, which I'm going to try to tie into our discussion. My recommendations this time are the audiobook for World War Z by Max Brooks, and also Devolution, the book, by Max Brooks. These are both really interesting. The World War Z is almost nothing like the movie, so if that's what you're basing it on, please ignore that part of your brain, that memory of yours. The book, World War Z, is an audio sort of series of recordings and interviews after the zombie apocalypse has come and mostly gone. And it is social commentary through zombie apocalypse analysis. And that sounds really weird, but it absolutely works. And the audiobook is wonderful because they have a full cast doing, so it sounds like it's genuinely some guy running around with a microphone interviewing a soldier who is at the Battle of Yonkers, or the former chief of staff to the United States president, or a CEO of a pharmaceutical company, or a shady doctor from Brazil, or whatever. Just lots of different people who intersected with the zombie apocalypse in interesting ways and can give sort of commentary on our society through that. Devolution is the same thing. It is social commentary on a lot of our current American consumerist culture through Bigfoot Attack. I can't explain this is a good book, because it just is, even though I know that sounds ridiculous. So social commentary through zombie apocalypse and Bigfoot Attack, World War Z, and Devolution, both by Max Brooks, which I will tie into our main topic when we get there. But Liz, go ahead and give us your recommendation for this week.
Okay, my recommendation for this week, I'm not usually a big poetry person, because even though I'm an English major, it just seems really often that poetry is obscure and confusing and esoteric. But I just finished a book of poetry that I did not find to be that way. And it's called A Book of Lamentations by James Goldberg. I have to show you guys the cover because I feel like it really fits the aesthetic of this episode. It's got some really great illustrations from Camilla Stark, who is an LDS artist. James Goldberg is a really fascinating LDS poet who has a Jewish heritage and Punjabi heritage, and just lots of interesting things. And these poems really resonated with me. I feel like it's very different reading someone who's writing poetry with your own religious language. He uses a lot of Book of Mormon metaphors, and there's a lot of biblical metaphors and references. And this book was written during the pandemic in 2020. And so there's lots of references to current events, and just, it's a book of lamentations, much like the one in the Bible, lamenting the state of our world and all of the bad things that are happening in it. And I found it very resonant with my own experiences, and just gave me lots and lots to think about. I put bookmarks all in it of things to come back to and to use someday in a lesson. So we're doing the Book of Lamentations in our church study right now. So I feel like it's a great time for people to pick that up and kind of read a modern version. So that's A Book of Lamentations by James Goldberg.
I was actually at a presentation at the MHA conference earlier this year with the illustrator as one of the panelists, and she does some really, really interesting work. So she showed me some of the work. So I haven't read any of the poetry, but I know that her pictures are very evocative. So,
okay, I got to tell you, Carl, you're going to love one of the poems in here is, let's see if I can find it fast enough. Excerpts from the first Temerian Mormon dictionary. So the Temerians are from Star Trek. They're the aliens who speak only in, analogies and references. And so he's translated all of the ones from that Star Trek episode into Mormon versions, and it's fantastic.
That sounds something that is right up my aisle. Absolutely. Sergio, why don't you give us your recommendation?
All right. Well, I'm currently reading the Doom Patrol comics. I've been going through Grant Morrison's run. Rachel Pollack, who was the first openly trans woman to write comics, her collection just came out, so I'm looking forward to cracking that open. And I'm watching a series called Bella Scoran. It's a Netflix series about a detective in Mexico in the 70s. It's based on some popular novels. And that's what I'm reading and watching right now.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Stephen, what's your recommendation for us this time?
So nowadays I mostly read whatever books I've assigned my kids to read for homeschool. So there are a lot of repeats. But right now my 9-year-old is reading Stargirl, which is written by Jerry Spinelli, who wrote Maniac McGee. I have all sons, so I've tended to direct their readings towards kind of male role models in literature. But obviously we want them to see the other side. So without going into too much details, this is one with a high school girl protagonist that is kind of a little more nuanced and less cardboard cutout than, sort of the princess with armor gender role inversions that you often see in literature nowadays as kind of a reaction to sort of the Disney princess model, right? So, and it forces the reader to ask questions about what the good life looks like in middle school. Again, from a female perspective. And so, hopefully that will cause some introspection on his part, but again, I think it answers the question well. And it's the kind of thing where it's a good template that I want my kids to see, to kind of make them think about how they want to prioritize things in their life.
All right. Thank you for that. And Jennifer.
I am watching two shows that both ask the same question, which is, what are the limitations of being a person in the healing professions? So the first one, it's a Hulu show called The Patient, where essentially a serial killer has kidnapped his therapist, has him chained to the wall, and is forcing him to give therapy to the serial killer. It's not over yet, but it's not going well for either one of them. And there certainly are some limitations on why therapy doesn't work in this coerced way.
I'm absolutely shocked.
Right. The other show is quite a bit more fun, but really interestingly enough, it's asking the same question. It's Roswell, New Mexico. Has anyone watched this show? Essentially, aliens crashed into Roswell whenever it was in the 40s, and they're still living among us, but they look like regular humans, but they have special healing powers. However, if they use their healing powers too much, everything is going to collapse. It's silly, it's campy, it's kind of science fiction meets like high school drama, but it is asking this interesting question of like, when is it your responsibility to use your healing powers for other people? And that's the same question as in The Patient. So I've enjoyed the back and forth on those two.
Excellent. And I can see why someone with your background and current life experiences would enjoy both of those. So thank you for those recommendations. All right. Thank you, everybody. Let's jump into our main discussion of Midnight Mass. I brought up World War Z and devolution as sort of social commentary through zombie apocalypse and through Sasquatch attack. But this is like religious commentary through, spoilers start now. If you haven't seen the show and you think,
please pause now and go watch it.
Go watch it and come back to this episode. This is religious commentary through vampire cult. And I found this to be one of the most arresting and interesting and thought-provoking things I have seen in years. There's just such an interesting diversity of characters and mindsets and approaches to religion that are all portrayed as this priest comes back and starts feeding everybody vampire blood, and the healing and miraculous things start to happen, and it's just a wonderful slow burn that I really enjoyed. But those are my initial thoughts on the whole thing. Let's just go around the horn and kind of get some basic thoughts from everybody on the thing as a whole before we dive into specific aspects that we enjoyed or didn't enjoy. Liz, let's start with you.
This was a really interesting watch for me. I was a little worried when Carl recommended something that's like real horror, because my horror tolerance pretty much goes I Am Legend level, and then beyond that I'm like, no no blood, none of this stuff. So it was a stretch for me. That being said, I really enjoyed it a lot. It was definitely not what I thought it was going to be. I expected there to be a lot more jump scares and gore, and it is not that. It is still very, very much horror, and there's a lot of dread and anxiety and really tragic bad things happen to people. It does not end happy. I think I only realized that halfway through the second to last episode. I was like, there is no good way for this to end, is there? I guess that's maybe my ignorance of horror tropes, that there would be a way out of this. So, but I enjoyed it.
Yeah. And we should say that it is quite violent, a lot more so than the other things we've reviewed on this podcast and talked about. This is, well, there are vampires, and so there's lots of blood, and there are people feeding on blood and things like that. So it's maybe not for the faint of heart, which is why in our last episode I recommended, if you might be interested, maybe get the VidAngel version of it so that you can, cut the stuff out that you're not interested in. But Sergio, what were your overall thoughts about the series?
Overall, I think I enjoyed it. I mean, like I said, we'll get into the nitty gritty on what I didn't like about it. Sometimes I feel like the only one that didn't like things, but I enjoyed it. I think to the point about the gore and stuff, or like the violence and all that, I don't think it's necessarily integral to understand the story. And I think if you do watch an edit, you're not going to miss much. But overall, it was very well done. It could be very much seen as not necessarily a character study, but more of like kind of a study of like our country and how like the weird intersection of faith and like power and like corruption kind of works. And in that sense, I think it kind of almost works more as an allegory, which I think makes it really enjoyable in a way too.
Yeah. Steven, what are your overall thoughts on it? You were the one who first turned me on to this, so.
Yes. So I'm a little worried that focusing on, yes, there is blood and there is gore and, all of that. But I am worried that with, focusing on that will turn religious people off towards it. I mean, there are certain scenes in here that I've literally put on my homeschool list for things my kids have to watch before they're 18. Not the whole series, but there are parts, right? That are incredibly moving. I mean, they like, for me, they are in my top like 20 list of most moving religious scenes in all of cinema at that level. And some might disagree, but for me, it was at that level, right? And so I do hope that religious people see it, and there you kind of know when the parts are coming, and you know when to skip if that's a concern. So again, like I said, generally speaking, I liked it. The production quality was great. You can tell they're really honing their art. So it was great from a sort of a spiritually moving perspective. But then, yeah, if you're also into the horror and gore, it's actually quite well done in terms of how it handles those tropes as well. But you can also just turn those off if you're not interested.
Sure. Yeah. Jennifer, what are your overall thoughts about this series?
I am not a horror fan in any way whatsoever. So that tells you like how compelling the story was to me that I was willing to sit through an entire horror series because I've just really got hooked early on. But then once you start to figure out what's going, it's such an interesting, to me, critique of what we actually believe is happening in religious life versus what maybe the reality is and what we want it to be. I was willing to put up with all the blood, all the gore, all the everything, because I think their exploration of the questions were really good.
Yeah. The last time we reviewed a horror show or movie on this podcast, it was Stranger Things Season 4. And one of our guests there, Barrett, really talked about how, to him, the added violence of Season 4 of Stranger Things, that he enjoyed that because it raised the stakes, and talked about how he enjoys horror when it has more, when there's more intensity, when there's more question about who's going to survive and who doesn't. And the thought that I had about that one is that, yeah, but Stranger Things' thesis is mostly just about outcasts and nerds. And we've had that for 3 seasons, so it wasn't as interesting to me to throw horror in. But when this one, throwing the horror in with religion and faith and these things, and even interfaith relations and atheism and redemption and sin and consequence and all this mixed together, I also was willing to overlook some of the violence and gore because there was just so much more going on in ways that I think weren't going on in Stranger Things Season 4. But let's talk a little bit about some of the things. Liz, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, on the other hand, the first 3 episodes are very, very slow. I pitched this to my husband. He's the one who likes scarier things than I do and can put up with more blood and stuff. So I was like, you want to watch this together? It'll be like our Halloween show, and we're watching it for the podcast. And he was kind of ready to quit after episode 3 until that last 5 minutes of episode 3. But it's a very slow burn buildup, and the beginning episodes are very much small town drama, religious questions type of thing. So it's an interesting mix that way, that it's not completely strong horror the whole way through. It's a very slow build.
Yeah. Really well crafted, and something that I also enjoyed is that you pointed out in our sort of show notes, Liz, is the names of the various chapters. The various episodes are all a book from the Bible, and that all work very well thematically with what happens in that particular episode. So.
Right? Like, I would be like, wait a minute, why is this episode called The Gospels? And then, like, at the end, you're like, oh, I should have seen that coming because of the name. But I did not see that coming at all.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit, I think, first about the portrayal of faith on screen, because I think this was a really interesting and compelling. So often we don't get shows or movies that I think treat faith as seriously as those of us who believe think it should be treated. But even though Mike Flanagan is now an atheist, he is a former Catholic, and this is very obviously him wrestling with some of the questions that posed by his upbringing and his transition from Catholicism to atheism that he's still sort of wrestling with and has on his mind. And so now that he's sort of bought his ticket to Netflix, he's done a lot of stuff on Netflix and horror. Now he's kind of bought a free ticket there because he's done so much good stuff for them. This was his passion project, and I think that's really interesting. So I don't know. Does anybody have any general thoughts about how religion was portrayed in this show?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
So for me, the main reason, and Sergio, I am not Catholic, so please jump in and correct me if I get some of this wrong. But one of the main reasons why this is interesting is, so in this context, it's a Catholic Eucharist service. Catholics have a belief called
Transubstantiation.
Thank you. And their belief is at a certain point in the ritual, it becomes the literal blood of Christ, and that has an incredibly deep and spiritual meaning for them. In the show, what is supposed to be the blood of Christ is replaced by something quite different, which the priest is trying to pass this off as the blood of Christ, and the people believe it to be, and it actually has some real positive consequences in the life of some of the people in the town. Like before we get to the bloody massacre, there are some people who experience a lot of goodness by what got put in that Eucharist wine. And so the question of what actually is happening in partaking of the elements in sacrament, like in a Latter-day Saint context, we don't talk a lot about like what is actually happening here. We talk a lot about like, remember the covenants you've made, remember Jesus Christ, but we don't really move beyond, is this just like a cognitive memory jogger that we're experiencing, or is there something like efficacious happening in it? And this show is playing with that question.
Yeah. Roman Catholics call it the presence. And this is one of the reasons why when you walk into a Roman Catholic church, you're supposed to cross yourself because you're entering the presence of the host. So, yeah. Sergio, I'd be interested in your take on anything Jennifer said or anything you'd like to riff on.
I mean, so this is where I come from it. I think it, broad strokes, covers it very well. I don't think it necessarily dives into anything beyond a surface level. Like you said, he's grappling with like his childhood memories of Catholicism. So you kind of get a childlike understanding of Catholicism in some ways. So, like for me, I felt, the aesthetics of having a priest, having the mass, having the communion thing is something we see so much and so done that when something's supposed to be engaging it, I kind of expect a little more. I kind of hope for a little more, especially if it's like supposed to be the main structure of it. And I don't really see that this show does more than that. I mean, like this could have easily been, in some ways like Protestants who believe in like an equivalent of the Eucharist and whatever else. And, go ahead.
Yeah, here's where I would love to hear your opinion on.
Yeah.
So instead of it being the literal blood of Christ, it's this vampire blood, right? Like, is that the right way to say it?
Yeah. Yeah.
My suspicion is that a lot of churches, and I'm not Catholic, so I won't speak there, but in our Latter-day Saint church, sometimes we metaphorically replace the liquid that we use in the sacrament with all kinds of other cultural ideas as if they are more healing than what Christ has offered us, right? Like we want mental health, we want enlightenment, we want rights for everybody, like all of the great, wonderful things that our culture can offer us. And we almost like secretly swap those out and say, gosh, the blood of Jesus, that's so boring. It doesn't actually even deliver what it promises to deliver, but such and such influencer, they do, and that's the actual liquid that I drink for sacrament.
So to that point, I don't really think that equates to this in some ways, because in Catholicism you believe in faith and works, right? And that's been like one of the great schisms in religion, right? Like some people say faith alone. Catholicism's always said about works. So I think that's like that. Those are some of the weird hinging points I find that make this a little like flawed in my mind, because it's like, yeah, you can have all the faith in the world, but if you're not doing anything to it, it doesn't really count. Even if you're taking the Eucharist in, which we're supposed to believe is the body and blood of Christ, in Catholicism, like it literally transforms. It gets a little strange. So I mean, like even that kind of feels weird to be like, I'm substituting angel's blood, quote in quotes, for what we believe turns into the body and blood of Christ, anyways. So like parts like that just felt like, look, we all know portrayals of faith in films aren't always accurate, so it's like I can forgive indulgences of it. It's just like I said, like it's not doing anything that's more inaccurate or less inaccurate than anybody else I've seen do things. So that's where I kind of like rate this a bit harsher than I think a lot of people do, because it was praised, even among Catholics. I think some Catholics were just excited to be like mentioned, like they're just happy to be noticed at the party. And I'm like, well, we've been around forever. Like if we really want our faith to be exhibited in works, it needs to be. We need to hold ourselves to a higher standard about what's accepted in that sense too. So that's kind of where like this falls off in my ratings a lot of times.
Our Latter-day Saint community kind of has the same reaction towards something like Under the Banner of Heaven, right? Maybe some people were excited to be mentioned, but the rest of us were just cringing.
Yeah.
I would say this is a little different than Under the Banner of Heaven, because I was thinking about the comparison as well. With Under the Banner of Heaven, we don't ever really get a religious service. And I think despite like it maybe could have engaged more deeply with Catholic doctrine, the fact that a good amount of this show is sermons, is in church, that was really interesting to me. I often, when there's a church scene in a Hollywood production, it'll be like, we'll sing some songs and then we're going to cut away because church is boring, right? Church, we don't know what to do with church. But here, like the actual experience of going to church was part of the action, was where things were critically happening to people. And I think that's what spoke to me as a religious person in this one. Although obviously I'm probably not bothered by the inaccuracies as much as someone who's in that culture. But I was like, oh, this is like actually portraying my life. And we have that same problem in LDS cinema. Like I can name on one finger the films that have portrayed an LDS service, and it's Brigham City, which is actually a great parallel for this, right? It has to do with the sacrament again and with guilt and anyway. But that one actually uses the LDS worship service as content in the movie. Like it's where important things happen, and that is so often left out.
Yeah. To that point, I think that's why a lot of people were kind of more excited about it, because it did actually center like priesthood. It did actually center a mass and like celebration. I don't even think they got the mass right, because what we call a sermon in most places is a homily, and that's not really supposed to be long. That's like a small portion of the greater mass. So it's kind of, so it's a little different. Like I said, and I think given what they were trying to go for, I'm not going to fault them too much on it. I think when I really fault them is like the worldview should have been exhibited in this supposed environment where everyone has the same beliefs, and it's clear like none of it meshes at all. But like I said, like what am I? It's kind of what are you really expecting out of this? So kind of tempering expectations.
So on that note, I guess from more of the social science perspective, the thing that kind of grated on me, and I know it's a vampire film, so you have to suspend belief, right? But of course, as a sociologist, I can't suspend belief for the sociology aspect, right? So where is this town, this small island in what looks like northeastern New England, where everybody is Catholic, and it's only about 100 people, and yet the diocese still, given the priest shortage, the diocese still finds it worthwhile to send one full-time priest just for these 100 people. I don't know. That was the part that kind of made it on me a little bit. So.
And New England isn't exactly known for being a predominantly Catholic area either. So it was like also like a very strange location for me at some point, because I was like, like if this was like some weird town in Texas, I could almost buy it, like South Texas or like New Mexico or like, somewhere like in the Southwest where like, believably that might happen. But it's just like, this is not like, again, New England is not known for having a Catholic history. There are Catholics in New England, but it's not like, what one thinks about when we think about the predominant faith in the region.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of reminds me of that film, the Three Billboards Outside Billings, Missouri, or whatever, right?
Ebbing, yeah.
Ebbing, Missouri, yeah, where it's a Catholic town, and they just inserted the Catholic thing to kind of take a predictable dig on the sexual abuse crisis. But I was like, what is this small town in the South where everybody's a Catholic, right? Like the South is not some, but it was interesting revealing that like Hollywood, it's like if an Iraqi filmmaker made a film and he did not know the difference between a Shia and a Sunni. Like it's that level of cluelessness about American Christianity that they're putting this Catholic town out in the middle of the South, right? And so yeah, I see a little bit of that here as well, and I get it that it's part of the, it's part of the story that he's telling, and so I'll allow some of that. But yeah.
I love that we are discussing the thing that we could not suspend our disbelief from were the demographics of the small fishing town, not the fact that there's an actual vampire. But
he sold it so well.
What was that?
I said he sold it really well. I mean, the vampire thing, like he makes it work.
Yeah. I like the Brigham City comparison because to me, when I showed Brigham City to my Mormonism class when I was teaching at Georgetown a couple of years ago, it occurred to me as I was watching it with them that this, except for the scenes revolving around the sacrament worship service, this could have been a Baptist town, and the entire plot would have worked exactly the same way. So I resonate sort of, Sergio, with your point, like that if this were just the Church of England or someone else who had maybe a little more of a high church setting, it still would have worked just as well, and it doesn't have to be explicitly Catholic to make a lot of the same points or to revolve so much of the plot around the worship service.
The blood piece is the only part I would push back on that. Because like Church of England, they're going to say there's some kind of presence in the bread and wine. It's not literal blood and body of Christ. They would call it real presence, but not physical presence. And because of how the blood is swapped out here, like that part actually does feel important. You can't interchange that piece of theology with Baptists.
That's fair. Yeah, that's fair.
The other thing with that was interesting was just like Under the Banner of Heaven, I felt like there were these occasional. I felt like Under the Banner of Heaven would occasionally touch these sort of, these touchstones in LDS thought to be like, oh, look how Mormon this is. We're talking about this aspect of Mormon culture, right? And you get that a little bit here, right? So like when he's talking about the, sorry, Sergio, I'm going to butcher this. What is it? The chasuble, the particular garment that the priest wears.
Yeah.
How it changes from, was it green to gold, depending on whether it's a holy day or not. And, there are these little things like that, but it's just, it's almost like it's just enough to kind of say, oh, look, that we kind of know what we're talking about with Catholic, and I kind of, it was the same vibe that I got from Under the Banner of Heaven, where, great, yeah, you got this guy who left the church 30 years ago and remembers the little cultural touchstones, and he's sprinkling it very intentionally throughout the movie. But besides that, you could tell it hasn't really been had a place in his heart for a while now.
Yeah, I think it kind of boils down to like a larger issue. I think in like film work in America, I think, and that's everything's purely aesthetics, right? So like nothing is ever like having a faith or even having any sort of belief, right, is like a philosophical worldview. It's something you engage in every day when you see the world and you see different things. And I think that's not really understood as much as it used to be. And I don't really know what the root of that is so much, but it's kind of interesting to see it. Like I think that's what strikes me more about Midnight Mass than anything else is that like you said, in a lot of ways, it could be interchangeable with any other faith. And it's like, but if you told a Baptist they were the same as a Catholic, like that, like if you try to explain that, oh, we're all the same, everyone's gonna be like, wait, what? No, like, some people might take more offense than others. Some people might say, well, kind of, and try to be polite about it. But it's interesting to talk about that in that sense that it's like the one Muslim character who's very visually not from the area, and but they don't really do anything else with that. I think they show him praying once. At one point, he talked about how he's ostracized from the city, but like I say, there's not really like an engagement besides the most visual, which is frankly the easiest way to illustrate those contrasts. And I thought that was, like I said, like for a show that's thoughtful in so many other ways, that seemed like a really a dimension that was really lacking in its production.
Sure. And I think one of the ways in which I think I would hope we would all agree that it was not lacking in, though, was the display, even though basically everybody is Catholic except for Riley, who is now atheist, and we have the two Muslim characters, and the son's just thinking of converting to Christianity and eventually does end up, converting to vampire cult for at least a couple hours. Yet at the same time, there are some really distinct worldviews represented by all the people, even though they're all ostensibly Catholic. Like we have, so Riley is atheist, right? We get that, but the younger Dr. Gunning is more of the sort of science approach to things, but her mother is sort of the devout, always goes to church lady. Who when she actually goes to mass for the first time in person for Easter Vigil, walks out and says, "Don't ever go back," because she's already clued in on something's going on here. We have Erin, who's kind of pantheist, at least at the end. She reveals that she's sort of pantheist, which is a whole host of heresy. And then I think I like the way that Liz, you put it in the show document on our notes that Monsignor Pruitt is a mystic or a misled prophet, and also that Bev is not right. How do we define Bev? That's an interesting question, because she seems to be like the stereotypical self-righteous sort of heinous person who just whatever. But I liked your calling her a cult leader. The fact that these people all go to the same church and have these really interesting interactions with each other, sort of, I think, is one of the big strengths of the show, is to have these sort of deep conversations. I can't remember another show where some of the most compelling parts are two people on a couch just talking to each other about stuff.
About religious beliefs, right? And about the difference between theirs. Because this is one of the criticisms we had for Under the Banner of Heaven, right? All the Mormons are uniformly the same kind of dupe, right? And they're all socially ostracizing anyone who doesn't follow the exact rules. They're all the same. They're interchangeable. And in this show, they're not interchangeable. They may not be accurate Catholics, but they're not interchangeable.
Sure. I don't know. That, to me, was...
Another interesting one is Riley's parents, right? Because at the end, when they are turned vampires, they're like, it doesn't change you, actually. You can still choose to be a good person and not murder your neighbors.
Right.
Just see where everyone else around them is just going for it, going whole vampire. So just seeing like the differences that like not all religious people are the same, which shouldn't be a nuance we have to demand from Hollywood, but hey, here we are.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I do think like the what was it, Mildred Gunning character, that was the one where usually when you see a character like that, I don't know, it is kind of like seeing like a Jewish banker or something like that, right? It is this very stereotype of a small town Catholic or Christian or whatever. And sure, I'm sure somewhere there are Muslim terrorists and there are Jewish bankers, right? But by placing that character in there, that kind of sets off sort of warning bells for me. Now, obviously, it's different because the small town Christian stereotype hasn't led to, thousands of years of brutality and murder and bloodshed. But still, it's the same thing where it's like you see the stereotype, it kind of raises your hackles a little bit. However, in this case, I feel like because I was like, okay, I will grant you your one stereotypical character, right? If we had a town of people like her, I would have shut the show off immediately, right? So I will grant him the one stereotypical small town hates other kind of religious character, but it still did kind of raise my hackles a little bit.
Yeah, that to me helped Bev's entire character exist without me wanting to turn the whole show off, because she was there obviously juxtaposed so much with all the other characters who were also believers but were not quoting scripture and trying to turn the town into a vampire apocalyptic cult.
It was just so mind-blowing the way she could twist anything. Like when they accuse her sort of killing the dog at the beginning, she manages to twist it somehow, quoting scripture so that she's now the victim. It's like, what? How do you do that fast? And she just is a fascinating and totally hateful character. You just want to strangle her the entire show. You're like, just stop talking. And Carl is right. The most satisfying moment is in the last episode when someone says, Bev, you're not a good person. And just says it to her face.
Well, and the part where she's like, it doesn't matter if you shoot me, I'll just get up 5 minutes later. Then she just shoots her and says, all right, we got 5 minutes. I forgot about that moment. Made me laugh so hard. It was great. Yeah, I'd be curious to get Jennifer's thoughts on Bev specifically, but on this sort of interplay of all these different sort of faith-believing people in different ways generally.
Yeah, well, I mean, in my opinion, Bev really wants to be a somebody. She wants to be a leader. She wants to be this kind of power broker almost. You can almost see in her heart that there's some good desire where she's trying to say hey, these practices, this sacrament really actually can do something good in you. However, then went through years and years and years, at least in my imagination, of it not doing that in her. And she found a replacement that did. Right? It happened to be vampire. And she actually, I'm actually not annoyed at her as much as I look at her and I think, oh my goodness, don't we all, people who are trying to be faithful, get frustrated at God, get frustrated at what we're told to do. I'm supposed to read my scriptures. Well, I didn't feel a darn thing and I haven't felt a thing for 6 weeks. Let me read this other thing. It makes me feel something. And in some ways, Bev probably started out a true believer. These rituals will help you. And then she found her replacement.
So, yeah, Sergio, I'd love to get your thoughts on sort of Bev as the cult leader / religious zealot, but all these other characters in general and their different worldviews and how that all intersects together.
Yeah, I mean, I was saying, that I really see it more as like a microcosm of the U.S. in some ways. That I mean, like the painful reality is some people are tempted by power. Some people do end up, using their faith to justify, gaining control. And I think the show kind of does a good job of illustrating the nuance of that. So Bev isn't just straight up someone who's just like Machiavellian necessarily. She's someone who actually believes in what she's doing and believes that the uprightness of it. And the priest also is like someone who believes this is necessary. The ends justify the means sort of thing. This is an angel, and I think like the fact that there is rejection at different times, and that the son, the sheriff's son wants to be part of the community. I think shows like temptations of all that. So I think in some ways, while it doesn't necessarily engage religion in a fundamentally meaningful way, I think it engages how religion ends up manifesting itself in the U.S. I think in particular, and how it plays out. And it obviously uses a small town dynamic to kind of emphasize that, where even the main character Riley is he's an atheist, but he also murdered someone, went to prison, so he's at a crossroads of how he feels about everything. Obviously the priest is the one person who he feels kind of understands him at this point, aside from So there was a lot of I guess sensitivity in the dynamics of engaging faith that I think isn't always there in other works, even if it didn't get the depiction of faith itself properly. Got the engagement of faith, I think, pretty well. That was pretty well done.
It really does. They get something right about Bev in her sort of, she defends these indefensible practices because she has a goal that of power or of whatever that is. And I don't know who wrote in the show notes, but someone is talking about, there are people and I certainly am not going to pick on Catholics. Abuse happens in all kinds of churches. And there are people who really, really rally around to defend the abuser, to, oh gosh, he's a great guy, he would never do that, even though they know perfectly well that things are sketchy. And Bev is just a spot on version of that. It's so that she can be in that inner circle of power.
So I think that's one of the most interesting things to think about from this show is how these people are misled. Like, even if you don't empathize with Bev at all, the priest himself, Father Paul / Monsignor Pruitt, he like really sincerely believes he's doing the right thing. And one of the most heartbreaking moments in the show is when he realizes, no, this was not a good thing. This was evil. And I have been part of it. And one of the questions I was left with at the end of the show, which I think was a good thing, is how do you prevent that from happening to you as a religious person who believes in some inherently non-logical, non-provable things? And how do we protect ourselves, make this boundary of not getting led down strange roads by crazy people, because those people are around in religion pretty frequently. And we in the LDS faith, we'd talk about, Elder Renlund's talk from last conference where he talked about the rules of revelation, that you shouldn't be receiving revelation for the whole church, or is this conflicting with the existing doctrine? And one of the Catholic reviews I listened to about this said kind of a similar thing, that they said because Father Paul is purposefully emphasizing the priority of conscience over traditional doctrine and things. And that's kind of a profound point in telling people, oh, don't listen to the church, listen to your own conscience. And that's opening the doorway for bad things to happen, because he's saying, oh, forget the doctrine. If it doesn't match up, you should listen to your heart.
You see this quite a bit in the evangelical world, in the big mega churches.
Like Mars Hill, are we talking?
We're talking Mars Hill.
I listened to that podcast. That was interesting.
I was a member at Mars Hill, so there you go.
Oh, fascinating.
Catholics are a little bit protected from this, just because the class of priests are not treated necessarily like rock stars. LDS clergy are very protected from this, because your bishop is probably also your insurance agent, and he ain't a rock star, right? But in the evangelical world, rock star pastor is an absolute thing, and he has a series of concentric circles around him that are there to protect him in every single thing he does. The Mars Hill example is perfect. The pastor there, Mark Driscoll, he plagiarizes his book that becomes a New York Times bestseller through cheating. Like, the guy cheats the system. He pays to get on that list, essentially. And all of the people around him just double down. No, Mark would never do anything terrible like that. Like, you misunderstand. You've got to trust this guy. Mark didn't have to defend himself ever, right? Because all the people did it for him. And that's Bev in this show.
Right. And that's why it's so heartbreaking at the end when he realizes what horror has happened. And then this was actually part of the show that I didn't enjoy, and I'd like to get Sergio's thoughts on sort of the stereotypical Catholic priest who's actually fathering children with people in his, parish. But they dropped that in episode 7. The last episode is when you realize that, Dr. Gunning is actually his daughter. And so all the times he said, oh, and we're all so proud of you. Like, there's this father there that he can't, reveal. And so it's heartbreaking when, after he has done so much good for these people, in quotes, that they all basically reject him, and he and his, now youthfully restored lover and their dead daughter go have this moment on the on that little bridge that she enjoyed so much when she was a little girl, and he has nobody else with him because because he has done some indefensible things and Bev has taken that and twisted that all together, it's heartbreaking to see him lose so much of everything there at the end. In some sense, like his fathering, Dr. Gunning with, Mildred, with the elder Gunning woman, is the original sin from which this entire catastrophe stems from. And it's, in that sense, I thought it was a great sort of meditation on the long-term repercussions of sin, especially when you keep trying to hide it and cover it up. It just gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse until you eventually have a vampire massacre.
As often happens.
As often happens, yes.
I mean, Little Among Us has not been part of a vampire massacre. To that point, I mean, I liked it. I felt like it could have been worked in more. I mean, how I feel about a priest fathering children and continuing being a priest in the same city, nevertheless, or same small village, feels very weird, to put it mildly. I don't think that would. I mean, like that sometimes happens back in rural areas of like the rest of the world. Not necessarily the U.S. at this point. But like, I felt like it could have been done as more of a hinge point, and it would have made it more interesting if like Bev is a person who did find out and kind of like use it to prod him too, to keep him in line. But like, so I felt like there's moments like that where I felt like we could have had more character nuance of this man, this priest who's supposedly like, you go from does he mean well, does he not mean well, and then it's like no, he actually did mean well the whole time, and then at the very end it's like, oh well, he regrets it, so now he's redeemed. And I thought that was kind of what makes it kind of a weird kind of arc about engagement of sin, because again, as I've said, like faith and works, like there wasn't really a penance. I mean, I guess the penance is they all watched the sunrise and they all burned, but that's not really like that's not really like atoning for anything, or that's not really like some of them clearly had regrets about it. Some of them didn't, and they all kind of had the same ending. So it's kind of, it felt, I don't mind it necessarily. I just, like I said, I felt fairly shallow in the sense of like, if this is supposed to be Catholicism or whatever, it just felt very surface in that sense too.
That final scene where Bev tries to bury herself in the sand when the sun is coming up, I feel like that's one of the best portrayals of like a final judgment type thing and a guilty conscience and just knowing that you're not ready.
Yeah.
That was a really powerful scene, like a depiction of finally realizing this is the end and I can't pretend that I'm going to change anymore. This is it. And I felt like that was really powerful.
I almost wanted them to quote that scripture where they talk about how the people at the second coming would feign that the rocks and the hills cover them up, because it's like literally what she's trying to do. But oh well.
But there was a lot of forgiveness, though, in this show, right? That's one of the other main themes.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that sort of this idea, because Liz, you said you didn't like the show. There's no way this is going to end well. I actually thought it ended really touching with the Muslim kid going back and rejoining his father's faith. Just to, and the first prayer of the 5 Muslim prayers is done at sunrise, and sunrise comes up and burns the kid to ash. The whole congregation singing "Nearer My God to Thee" as Bev screams and tries to bury herself, and like everybody's having this really nice, grace-filled moment, which I think is I don't know, more positive than maybe you thought it was. But the two sort of super arresting moments that I want to get everybody's thoughts on were when Riley dies. And it's interesting because the sun comes up and he looks up and the person sitting across from him on the boat isn't Aaron anymore. It's the car crash victim who we have seen through the entire show as this dead girl with like the lights flashing through the holes in her skull after he hit her with his car. And she's there, and she's kind of dressed nice, and she's really happy and seems very content, and takes his hand, and they both stand up as if to go to heaven. And it's this wonderful, grace-filled moment of he has beaten himself so much over this, and then she shows up at his death, and I don't know in the cosmology what's going on with that or where that's fitting, but it made me cry the first time I saw it. To think of this ultimate act of Christian grace and forgiveness, to forgive those who trespass against you, in this case, the person who ran you over, was just stunning.
Can I jump in there? I actually, and I'm with you. That is a really really touching scene, and it felt a tiny bit heavy-handed, in my opinion. Of I get tired of the kind of religious message of, okay, victims, you actually owe forgiveness to the people who hurt you in a demanding kind of way, and if you can't do this, then like there is no happy ending. Like, it's a lot to put on a person who is a victim, and like we see that in the abuse world a lot. Not nearly as much anymore, but it used to be like, how do you fix an abuse problem? Well, you get the victim to forgive the abuser, problem solved. And so I actually didn't. I watched that scene probably about 3 or 4 times, and I actually did not love it because it puts a lot on victims.
That is a fair point that I completely concede to you. I still, on some level, as someone not involved in a situation like that, do believe that that is the ultimate Christian goal of everybody going to heaven and being neighbors. Um, but yeah, there's some people. Some people are going to have to do some more work than Riley did, I think, to get to that point, and that is absolutely a fair point that I concede 100%.
I would also call on the question whether it was his actual victim coming down to forgive him, and more just his own perception of it all. I mean, because this is where I get kind of negative on it too, because I don't really feel like anybody was actually forgiven by anybody but themselves. Like, they all kind of forget. Like, I forgive myself for doing terrible things. Like, well, yeah, you killed everyone who didn't forgive you. So it kind of felt like a bit of a weird, like, self-indulgent, like, kind of moment. And with Riley, it worked out very well because he's like, I would rather like die feeling with who I am than like live out this like hollowed life. And like, I think in that sense, like, it feels a bit more touching and more profound versus the end when they all realize, oh, we've done terrible things and we're all gonna like. It's like, well, so you're all forgiving yourselves after you've murdered the entire town and burned down everything, which felt a little strange.
It's a little self-indulgent. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, and it's you're supposed to like be with them and be like, oh, this is so beautiful. And you're like, well, like, is it? And especially like, again, this is like you've all ingested evil and you're all like, oh, well, but now we're good. And, so, I mean, in one way it's like that, but I think in the other way, like, of them accepting the consequence of like the sun and the truth, or however you want to phrase that, of burning basically, with the exception of Bev, who tries to dig a hole. Like there is something interesting there. It's just, like I said, like, I don't feel like it goes quite far enough to make it like, oh yes, this is an actual redemptive moment for any of them in any way. Riley comes closest, but even then, it's kind of like, he's seeing the victim as like, it's almost more him forgiving himself.
Yeah, that's the way I read it. If you don't read it as her really being there, as it being part of his belief that, he'll see this vivid dream at the end of his life, right? That's his perspective on the end of life. That he's finally able to forgive himself, because the whole movie, every time he goes to sleep, that's who he sees, and he can't sleep. And he just is racked by guilt about this action. So having said that, I didn't expect the ending to be as sad as it was. I actually did like the ending. I didn't read it as exonerating the people of the island for what they did. I read it as this moment where you realize God is just and I have made a mistake. And it's not forgiveness. It's, I deserve this because of what I did. And we didn't stop this from happening. And we could have done something different, but we did not. And so we deserve this. So I read it more as a justice thing. The end of it is accepting God's justice rather than accepting forgiveness.
Well, and he's intentionally ambiguous, he is intentionally ambiguous on that point as well, right? Because when the person who's kind of the believer sort of converts to pantheism or whatever that is at the end, so she goes from believer to pantheist, kind of light atheist, right? And then conversely, you have this atheist that has this kind of afterlife moment, right? So you could tell that the writer, producer, whoever was kind of trying to thread this needle of not coming down on kind of the atheist or the believer side, because you kind of see these conversions sort of cross wires a little bit, right? Which obviously raises the point of like, okay, this is ambiguous, right? Is he going into heaven with this person? And again, I also thought it was touching. I mean, the fact that she was somebody who had passed on that was potentially kind of being involved in his kind of sort of personal sort of atonement experience, I think kind of helps with that. My wife pointed out that with that when he talks about guilt in this world without the atonement, I think that's kind of insightful, right? Because one of the great things about oblivion for him is this is finally what gets rid of the guilt. Until you have oblivion, you will always have this, and so I take everything that everybody has said. Those are all valid points, but I do think that it did kind of convey this, like that the final end is this, is the point where everything is okay and God wipes away our tears and everything is all right. Again, doesn't justify, dismissing it or downplaying it, but there is that moment kind of at the very end, which I thought was very powerful. But again, he's ambiguous about whether it was actually a thing or whether he was just delusional. Who knows?
So maybe the better plot line to talk about forgiveness from is not necessarily what happens to all the people at the end, or even Riley, but the Lisa arc with the guy who shot her and paralyzed her. Because that's a great little scene in the middle there. Liz, I know you wanted to talk about that. Why don't you go ahead and?
Well, now I'm recontextualizing it all in the light of what Jennifer said. I think it's interesting that she's not able to forgive him until after she can walk. Like, it's been years since she's been paralyzed. And it's interesting that she finally is able to do it after the effects of what happened are gone. That makes an interesting implication. I don't know what you think about that, Jennifer.
We put an awful lot on victims. And forgiveness is good. That is a virtue. It's a right and godly thing to aspire to. And we expect it so fast from victims before they even have time to process it. I had not thought of that character in this way, but I think you're right. That's an interesting example of it.
It's hard to have that forgiveness when you aren't healed, right? And she's one of the most devout characters as well. Like, her and her parents are at church every week, every day.
Every day.
Every
Yeah,
day.
and she wants to be healed.
Yeah. But it until it happens, it is hard for her to forgive him. Like, her family is also complicit in, his ostracization from the town, right? Small town, you accidentally shoot someone, well, no one's going to talk to you again. So it's interesting that it takes that healing, and maybe that's a good commentary on healing for victims, is that it may not come until the next life when things are healed.
A lot of the work that I do is in kind of this like victim advocacy in the church abuse world. And one of the criticisms that gets thrown at victims a lot is, oh my goodness, they're just after money. They just want a settlement. As if what happened to them didn't have real financial consequences for them, that it didn't like lower their ability to earn money, lower their ability to get an education. I am intimately involved with probably a dozen of these like cases across the country, and it is a remarkable thing that the 6 or so people that I am very close to who have gotten to the other side of this, when you have an official institution like a court telling you what happened to you was wrong, it came at real actual cost to you that we can put a number on, there is something incredibly healing in that does let you let some things go.
Which, to turn it back to the scene with Riley, was why I felt that was so arresting, because whatever happened to his nameless victim, if we take it seriously that she has arrived to bring him to heaven herself, and again, that might not be the case, it is unclear whether this is just his brain firing off as he self-immolates as a newly formed vampire, or if there's something genuinely real going on here. Although we can quote Dumbledore, just because it's happening in your head doesn't mean it's real, Harry, right? Whatever.
Not real, yes.
Right. I took it to be that way, like, because she has gone to the next side and has been healed from all this, the pain and sorrow, she can come pick him up and be like, hey, it's all right, why don't you come with me now? And but I take very seriously this thought that maybe that is something that waits until all the healing is done, which is something I think we in our Latter-day Saint tradition don't talk about enough, the healing aspects of the atonement. We're happy to talk about wiping away sin, but we don't talk nearly enough about the fact that Christ also heals us from our sins and from what other people's sins have done to us.
C.S. Lewis's book, Till We Have Faces, is an entire book on that subject.
It wasn't me who brought up C.S. Lewis this time, guys.
Like I mean, the 2-sentence version of that is there are two sisters and one of them dies, and the dead sister is the one who kind of comes and brings back some redemption to her other sister because she has been healed, and he plays that out the entire book.
It's a really good book if you haven't read it.
Absolute favorite Lewis book.
So, sort of the last thing I wanted to make sure we talked about were the 3 sort of speeches about what happens after you die, because it's very obvious to me that Mike Flanagan is sort of talking about this. And I know you brought it up a little bit, Stephen, sort of the atheist conversion maybe to sort of theism and the theist conversion to sort of pantheism. But then also her beautiful speech about what happens, what she believed has happened to the child that she has now miscarried because of all the shenanigans going on with the vampire blood. So we kind of have one speech that gives a beautiful sort of Carl Sagan-esque view of the universe from an atheist perspective. Even, I think, quotes Carl Sagan at some point, or at least something that Carl Sagan said. And then we have the view of what happens to the child who was never even born but just goes straight to heaven. And then we have Aaron's speech at the very end, where I think it's obvious that this is where Mike Flanagan sort of comes down on personally now, wherever he is in his faith journey, on Aaron believing that it's almost Buddhist. She is part of the universe. The drop returns to the ocean. That's a very Buddhist metaphor, but in a pantheistic way, because that's what we talk about when we say the word God, she says at one point. And so,
right. Yeah, I really like. Okay, I did think that the conversion to pantheism was a little strange because you're in the middle of getting, eaten by a demonic creature from the Holy Land. It seems like that would do, that would change your faith to be a little more reified and concrete, right? So it was a little weird that was the moment where she kind of went into sort of this fuzzy pantheism, right? But again, okay, I get what the writer's trying to say, so I'll let him do that, right? And then again, yeah, I really enjoyed the atheist. Again, it was a very powerful atheist sermon, I thought. Which there aren't a lot of those, frankly. I feel like most people, when they do try to sing the praises of atheism as a social or philosophical system, it kind of lands a little flat with me. Obviously, I'm biased. But I thought that did a very good job of kind of showing sort of the possible numinousness, right? Again, at the end of the day, I don't buy it, but I couldn't help but be moved in a way, right? Well, and I like how he sort of recognizes the shortcomings, right? Where after he does his spiel and then she does her spiel, and then he says, well, I hope you're right.
and that's her spiel about the miscarriage, which is very different than the one she ends up with, which you said you were going to make your kids watch in the show notes.
Yes. Yeah, so that is the scene that's required watching for my kids, is the back and forth when she does talk about the miscarriage. Because it does, I mean, that is a very Latter-day Saint discourse, right? Where heaven is about the family and it's about the relationships, and it's all there once you get to the other side and you connect with other people. and she doesn't even know this child, but she has this connection to the child that she loves. And I think that, we don't talk enough about miscarriages, frankly, in our society. It happens to so many women. And, and I'm surprised that he had the guts to even raise this, because given everything I'm sure he was doing the writing for this long before the Dobbs decision came out, right? But in his world, in secular Hollywood, to even kind of address this thing that the fetus has some kind of personhood, I'm sure was a little tricky for him, but it still recognized that very religious perspective in a very moving and powerful way. And I think I mentioned this to you, Carl. Like, I will. So he gives enough. You can kind of tell where he comes down, but he does such a good job portraying the religious side that I say, okay, you've done a good enough job with that. I will grant you this other. I will grant you your own sermonizing about your perspective, because you did such a good job portraying the religious, side in a very moving way.
I think he definitely steel-manned the other points of view that he disagrees with through the show.
What it actually made me think of was the the drop of water is the wave and it returns to the ocean. In LDS theology, we would not say that, right? About what our eternal destiny is. And yet we will say things like, this child came from heaven, it wasn't even born, it returned to heaven, right? Like the wave returned to the ocean. Like there is some, it's kind of tangential, but there is some overlap there. And that points it out in a way. There's also, there's some overlap that gets. Catholics and Mormons have a really, really different understanding of what's going on in the sacrament. But there is some overlap there that I don't think most people think about. In Catholic theology, that's physical body and blood of Christ. Like who else goes around talking about God having a physical body as obsessively as Mormons do, right? Like we mean that differently, and yet in both faiths there's this longing for God to have some kind of body that can be touched. And you get some little snippets of that in here.
There's a really great book called Catholic and Mormon.
Michael Webb
and Gaskill.
Yes, thank you.
Which is fascinating. I really enjoyed that book. I felt like it helped me understand the things we have in common with Catholics a lot more.
Absolutely. And there is a lot, but we don't think about it very often.
Yeah, we've hung out with Baptists too much because of the Republican Party. But anyway, yeah. Sergio, you had a comment on our phone conversation earlier that I wanted you to sort of riff on a little bit while we're talking about these different worldviews presented, because you talked about how you didn't feel it was very Catholic because it never really brought up the issue of free will. And so I wondered sort of what your thoughts were on that and this discussion we've been having sort of about the three monologues about what happened after you die.
Yeah, I think with the exception of Riley, almost everyone else is kind of like a hapless agent. And, like they don't really have agency. They don't really embrace it as much as like, Riley only does like at the very end, right? When he chooses to die. So I did feel like, like some of those things, like, I don't necessarily think like you need these tenets to be like Catholic, so to speak, like free will or like faith and works and some of these things, but like they're pretty important to like the worldview again of like righteousness and Catholicism and all that. And I think it was something that felt really lacking. And I think in relation to these speeches, I think one of the things that's kind of funny, I think, about all this is that, Flanagan's like strength really is his ambiguity in this story. He doesn't really tell you what's good. He doesn't really tell you what's bad. You kind of have to draw the connections yourself, what he might favor, what he doesn't favor. And I think I really found that this kind of interesting in that sense too, where again, it's more situated like almost like an exploration of like how the country navigates belief, I guess is the way to say it. And I think for people that don't believe, how do they navigate the concept of believing in something, right? And like I don't necessarily find it all compelling the way he presents it, but I do think he at least is sincere in the intent, and I think there's something really interesting to be said about that level of sincerity and that level of willingness to be like, well, if all of them are kind of on equal footing in, you know, at least like the greater society, you know, not like what wins out, but like, you know, like what does that leave us if we're all side by side in the same small town or in the same area? And I think that's what kind of sets off like the quasi clashes in the whole series, and you know, like different people, you know, trying to find a way to live with each other despite the fact that some of them clearly have different beliefs or clearly feel outsiders or clearly want to fit in. And I think so it really just kind of makes it interesting that it's almost like it's he doesn't actually say what he prescribes, but it's kind of centered in a way that I think makes it more interesting as a character study almost of the country's a microcosm than you know, like just a pure horror. You know, like you said, it starts off kind of slow because you're kind of getting drawn to this web.
Yeah, it's definitely more about the characters than it is about the vampire cult that ends up showing up at the end. But I like your point that Riley is about the only person who really exhibits some kind of agency or exercises his free will, which sort of leads me to the question: is self-immolation the only moral choice you can make as a vampire? Because I think it is, and they all make it in the end. So good on them, I guess.
And it's just so unexpected, right? Like, that's the end of the episode called The Gospels. And that's at the end you realize, oh, he literally laid down his life for these people on the island so that he would not become a vampire and destroy them, right? So it was very unexpected. I don't think I've ever seen a vampire story where that's a solution. Like, we've seen Twilight vampires, right? Where you can decide not to be vegetarian vampire or whatever. But yeah, this choice that no, I shouldn't exist in the world. I'm too dangerous to other people. I'm going to be done with this. It was very interesting. And
Well, it was an interesting mix of Christian and Muslim theology, right? Because I feel like there's the Christian of you know, the sacrificing themselves, but then also the final scene, it's the Muslim praying. I mean, he's praying towards Mecca. He's not praying towards the east, towards the sun necessarily. But there was kind of that image, right, of like praying towards the sun as it comes up and immolates him. Um, and you know, immolates the son, the son, you know, his son, while the father dies down, right? And so you have this interesting mix of theologies and religious themes at the exact same time. You know, the Muslim praying towards the sun while, you know, the Christians are burning alive, you know. So it's, I did think that was very rich.
Yeah. And this is something I didn't notice until I rewatched it in preparation for the podcast. That's Easter morning. Like, when the sun comes up and burns them all to death, it's the sun rising on Easter morning, which, I don't know, just really interesting to me that they sort of worked, you know, oh shoot, Sergio, what's the name of Easter Vigil? Like, they worked Easter Vigil Mass into part of the story, and then it just didn't occur to me that, you know, paying attention to all the horror of this, all these vampires now running around the city and killing people, whatever else, like, I forgot that the next day after Easter Vigil Mass is Sunday, and it is Easter Sunday, and that is the day when the sun comes up, and we're supposed to celebrate the resurrection of Christ, and they're all singing "Nearer, My God, to Thee" as the sun vaporizes them. And I don't know, it made the ending even a little more poignant to me. Just a detail that I had. There were a couple details that I caught on the rewatch that are interesting. It's a very tightly woven and tightly scripted.
can I point out one more thing before we've been recording for a long time, so we got to wrap it up. But in the scene in the school where the Muslim sheriff is like pointing out why it's not okay to be giving out Bibles in school, the speech that he gives about the differences between Muslim belief in the Bible and our belief in the Bible, he sounded like really Latter-day Saint at that point. I was like, is he talking about the great apostasy? Like, are we going to bring the Book of Mormon in here? That would be a plot twist. So I'm going to have to do some more research on our commonalities with Muslims, because I had no idea that, like, it would sound so similar. And I was like, okay, agree with you. Okay, maybe we're different here. But it was interesting.
Yeah. There's a great article by Dan Peterson called, I think it was in the Inside, called, like, Muhammad the Prophet. And calling Muhammad a prophet is a big deal in our tradition. And he did. And I think he's still right to have done so. But that's a great article. We can put that in the show notes. Does anybody have anything else they wanted to bring up really quick before we go around to our ratings? I did also like the fact that they did have a minority religion represented, and you did get a good variety of responses to that. Everything from Bev, like, oh, that's just a terrorist. He gets called a raghead at some point, which is stupid because that's the Sikhs, not the Muslims, but it's one of the altar boys. So, what would this teenage kid know? Even the mayor who's like, why don't you just come to mass just to be part of the community, right? Like, we should all, especially those Latter-day Saints living in the Intermountain West where there are lots of them, maybe could learn something from this show by watching it and saying, oh, this is what it's like to be a member of a minority religion in an area dominated by a particular religion, and in Utah and Idaho and parts of Arizona and Nevada, that would be the Latter-day Saint Church. That's us. Yep. So, all right. But moving on to our ratings segment. As always, we rate. We have 3 different ratings. The first is for content, and we rate it on a scale of celestial, terrestrial, telestial, or outer darkness. And I am very curious to see how this one turns out, because you can't separate some of the bad content from the themes, and I don't know. So we're just gonna start with you, Liz. Go ahead. What do you give it?
Okay, I've been thinking about this. I think I would make an argument for Telestial, because the Telestial kingdom is supposed to be like the world in which we now live, right? This is a very good representation of a fallen world, of like it's literally fallen as we watch it fall. And there is quite a bit of language, especially from Joe Colley. I'm not saying that it's a bad show for this content. I'm not saying the content isn't necessary to tell this story, this vampire story. I'm just saying, if you are someone who is sensitive to that kind of content and wouldn't feel it's worth it, you should know that that's the level of content that's in there.
Sergio, we've kind of asked you to adopt the Latter-day Saint cosmology for this rating, but I'm curious, what would you sort of rate it? Like,
I mean, take my rating with a grain of salt. But I think I'd rate it celestial. I mean, like obviously, I think for the Mormon listeners and viewers, it might be a bit different. But for me, it's like all the violence was kind of tied into the stories and actions, and while it's not needed, it never felt gratuitous or indulgent. It always felt like it's like an outer um, exhibition of their own sin. So I think like in that sense, like it never, like I said, it didn't fall into gratuity or gore either. So while it might be like a little unsettling for some that might not enjoy that at all, it didn't feel like ever like I'm gonna roll my eyes and I'm never gonna enjoy this. It actually impedes my enjoyment or my understanding of the story. And so I mean, again, take that as you will. Different communities and different things, understandings, but that's how I think I'm gonna rate it with that.
I I I actually would have to say terrestrial. And here's why. So many of the characters wanted to do the right thing, and their torment is like that they can't, that they like these are some of the, not all of them, some of them are good people who get sucked in by the power grab and by all of these things. They didn't wake up one morning and say, hey, I want to ruin my community. They got carried away by some stuff that's awful. um but did they set out to be evil? I don't know. So I put it in the middle. The turtle.
yeah. How about you, Steven?
So I see there's a section for content and then gospel connections, right? And I do feel like this is in that Venn diagram. It's a small overlap, but it does exist of things that are very, violent, but they have very spiritually important. They're spiritually and religiously quite moving, um if you've seen like the movie Silence, for example, where it's like they're torturing people all throughout the movie, right? But it's still very moving, religious messages, right? So this is one of those, right? So again, so as far as the content goes, I would put it at telestial. It's not like there's the violence, but there's no sex whatsoever, and there is language. But so it's definitely for like older teens at the least. And then if you just don't, like I said, and if you aren't into violence at all, and you have no desire, my wife has absolutely no desire, for example, but there are definitely scenes that can just be taken as their own and viewed, and you don't have to watch the violence to get all of it. But the violence is definitely there, and like has been said, it's not gratuitous and it's part of the plot. So it's there though. So I would give it Celestial.
I would also rate this like Jennifer terrestrial, but for the reasons that Sergio gave, because none of this felt gratuitous to me. All the gore and the blood especially is definitely in theme with vampires, and there even so, I've seen enough movies where it is gratuitously overdone. There was blood here, but they never, I felt, did it just to do it. It was there in service of the plot and the themes. The moment where Annie stabs herself in the neck to lure these two vampires to her to give other people a chance to escape is very violent, but is a moment of self-sacrifice, and it is very startling. But
In many ways, the violence is less objectionable than what you get in like a Marvel movie, right? We're not glorifying any of this violence, right?
yes, absolutely.
Ooh, this is so cool to watch people fight and destroy a town and there's civilian casualties, but hey, who cares? This is like morally considered violence, but still violence.
Yeah, it's not glamorized. It's not akin to like modern warfare either. So you're like, like a whole building collapse, and you're like, you know, supposed to struggle to move on, or because you thought it was a cool explosion. Like it's never made that this violence is supposed to be like enjoyable to watch, right? Like,
I like that phrase, morally considered violence. Well, so that's why I give it terrestrial. I'm outvoted 3-2 now, but there you go. And on the issue, or on the rating of artistic merit, we give it 1 to 5 popcorn balls. I'm just gonna say I'm just gonna give this one 5 because I thought the writing was good on the rewatch. It's very tightly scripted. All the different pieces fit together really well, and uh, it's just the acting is really good. When the key points are 3 just monologues of people just sitting there talking like on a couch, that tells you that the acting and the writing are both really good, because there's nothing cinematically compelling about that. It is literally just a camera slowly zooming in on the person's face while they talk. And yet I was completely absorbed by those moments. And so, I don't know. I give it 5 popcorn balls. But let's go in reverse order this time. Stephen, what did you think? Artistic merit, 1 to 5 popcorn balls.
I know I'm a big fanboy of this series, but I actually think it's 5 as well. I mean, I think the craft of the art of making movies, the production quality, I think is just keeps on getting better and better. And I've seen some of this. I forget if he's the producer or director. He does a lot of other Netflix stuff.
Mike Flanagan.
Mike Flanagan, yeah, and I've seen some of his other stuff, and I feel like I have a hard time thinking of how a horror movie or series could be better than what he's doing, given the tropes and the conventions. And yeah, it's a formula, but he's got that formula down, right? One of the benefits of having a formula is you can kind of refine it, and just like you said, you can fine tune it, make everything really tight, right? So as far as the horror formula, I think in terms of the artistic merit, the production value, I have a hard time seeing another horror movie that could sort of beat this one out.
Jennifer, 1 to 5 popcorn balls.
I mean, horror is not my genre, as I have said, and yet, I guess 5 popcorn balls, and here's why. When you see a like a beautiful made up woman. She's all put together. You don't want to say, oh, she really applied her blush really well, right? Like you don't want to notice the makeup. You want to notice, oh, that let her beauty shine through, right? And there's nothing in this show where you go like, oh, what a neat feature that was. Like it doesn't feel like the aesthetics are fighting with anything. Like they're supporting what's going on. They're making the show beautiful instead of you going, oh, what a neat
Camera trick.
yeah. Like I don't love the camera trick, right? Like it makes me feel like, oh, that's very lovely applied mascara, but I shouldn't be noticing how you applied your mascara. I should just be noticing you, right? And so I would say 5 popcorn balls because this show does that well.
Excellent. Sergio, what do you think?
Um, I'll give it 5. I think 5 popcorn balls. I think to Steven's point, it fits a certain niche and criteria. It's going to be judged against other films that fit in that niche and criteria. I'm not going to expect this to be like, it's not changing cinema, it's not changing the world or like in the sense of like what it's doing, but it's definitely at the better end of like a horror movie that should be enjoyed. And like will I go back to it every year? Probably not. But like like it's something I didn't feel angry about watching, or I didn't feel annoyed or bored, like upset that I watched it, right? And I think at this point, with so much content being churned out by all the media giants, that's enough. Like it's enough to just have a solid product given to you, and I think that this is that.
All right. And Liz?
I'm gonna make it quick. 5 popcorn balls from me too. The one thing nobody's mentioned yet is the music, the creepy hymns. Like 100% here for the creepy hymns. It was very weird effect, and I enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's good. It's very true. I on the rewatch, I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. Anyway, and our final rating is Gospel Connections, and I'm going to start with Stephen because I liked your thought that the content and the Gospel Connections are an interesting Venn diagram overlap moment in this one. So 1 to 5 apricots. What do you think?
Yeah, I think 5. I think it, like I said, it touches on spiritual themes that not a lot of other movies have, right? There's some movies that try to touch on certain spiritual themes, but they're usually kind of the conventional ones. Or they do it in sort of a ham-fisted way. And this did it in a very, I know this is probably more artistic merit, but it wasn't ham-fisted, but it was still very moving. And that's a very hard needle to thread, right? Making something moving without coming off as a little bit much or cheesy, right? It's a hard thing to do in practice. And I feel like this kind of hit that target, and it hit that target with themes that aren't usually discussed in cinema, and it did it in a very fair way to everybody involved, to all the different perspectives involved. So for those reasons, I'm giving it 5.
Liz, what do you think? 1 to 5 apricots.
It's I mean, I think 5 is the right place to land it because it is a story that is concerned with morals. Like that is like the focus of this is the morality and the questions of religion and how did we get here and how do people lie to themselves with religion. I think it's a great movie to discuss with those who can handle the content.
Right. Yeah, I definitely think this is for older teenagers and nobody under that.
I asked my husband, I said, do you think we would show the kids this? And he's like, 16 probably would be, yeah, if they're able to handle that.
I'd be curious to get your thoughts on sort of that message, Sergio, as somebody who teaches high school, but we'll go to you next anyway. I'll toss it to you. 1 to 5 apricots. And we'll have to explain why we're using popcorn balls and apricots maybe after this show wraps. 1 to 5 apricots. What are your thoughts?
I think I'm gonna knock it down to a 4. I've said before, it kind of engages. It does want a lot more credit for engaging the gospel than it actually bothers to do. I think at times, I think like titling the episodes after books in the Bible feel like a little gimmicky, a little gimmicky, especially considering like the shallow engagement of faith in general. I don't think it's bad. I think it's better than a lot of things, but I think for a show that's supposedly centering all of this, it should weave it in a little more. But that's just me. So I think 4 out of 5.
And Jennifer, how about you?
I mean, the 5 of us have been at this for 2 hours. And my sense is if we could sit and talk more, we would. So there is plenty of gospel connections here to talk about for people who are willing to look past the blood and the whatnot. Five apricots.
I think I'm also going to land on 5 apricots, but I am also glad that when we came up with this rating system, we did split them up a little bit. Maybe it's an unfair system to split them up, but in this case, I definitely think that they all overlap. The artistic merit, the content, and the gospel connections all come together in a unique way in this one, more than I think any of the others that we've reviewed for this podcast. So anyway, thank you all for that. Let's go around the horn real quick to where can people follow you on social media or if they want to come chat. I'm Carl Cranny on Twitter. That is my Twitter handle. It's just my name. Liz, where can people find you?
You can follow my writing and book reviews on lizbusby.com and links to my socials on there.
Awesome. And Jennifer, where could people find you if they wanted to find you?
I don't know, Facebook, Instagram. I don't have a thing. Find me on Facebook.
But there's lots of good podcasts with Jennifer on them. If you search, you'll find them.
If you listen to literally any LDS podcast, you've heard me, and you've probably heard too much of me. So there you go.
And Steven, is there any social media you'd like to plug?
I'm a perma blogger on timesandseasons.org. My professional website is stevencranny.github.io.
And Sergio.
So I'm the Phantomas, TheeFantomas. That's where I tweet about things that come to my mind. Those of you that don't know, I talk about a lot of pop culture. Some of the stuff I say might be a little edgier, but so this is my warning.
Thank you all for joining us this week. Liz, would you like to pitch our next episode, please?
Yes. Next time, we're going to be discussing Howl's Moving Castle, Hayao Miyazaki's 2004 film, which is an adaptation of the Diana Wynne Jones fantasy novel about Sophie, a young woman who is turned old by a witch, and her adventures with the vain young sorcerer Howl, who lives in a moving castle. This is one of my favorite movies, another anime, but this one is really interesting. It's whimsical, but very intense. It's appropriate for the whole family, though some parts may be too frightening for young children. It's available to rent on most streaming platforms, so you can be ready for that conversation next time.
All right, thanks for that. We'll look forward to that conversation. Thank you all for joining us once again. This has been Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, encouraging you to seek after everything virtuous, lovely, of good report, or praiseworthy. See you next time.